In 1975, 500 factory workers in South Bend, Indiana, did something that had never happened before in American capitalist history. They bought the company, every share, every machine, every blueprint. They assembled $9.2 million in federal loans, municipal bonds, and bank credit. And they purchased the factory where they had spent their careers, kept it out of liquidation, and became, almost instantly, the largest fully employee-owned company in the country. 5 years later, those same workers walked out. They set up picket lines outside the factory they legally owned. They screamed at the managers they technically worked for. And the national press descended on South Bend to cover one of the strangest labor disputes in decades. The owners were on strike against themselves. But the real story of South Bend Works is not the strike. It is the decades before it and the years that followed. It is the story of two identical twin brothers from County Cork, Ireland, who built one of the most influential lathe companies in American history, authored the handbook that taught a generation of machinists, armed the United States Navy during World War II, and then watched their creation get buried under corporate indifference, idealistic finance, and the slow grind of Rust Belt decline. Every week we tell the stories behind the machines that made the modern world. The story starts in County Cork, Ireland, around 1870. That is the year John Joseph O'Brien and Miles William O'Brien were born, identical twins. Their father Daniel and their mother Mary, whose maiden name was Joyce, raised them in a working-class Irish Catholic home. Mary died in childbirth. Sometime in the 1870s, the family immigrated to Connecticut, where John and Miles grew up attending public and parochial schools, and where both of them entered the machine tool trade. Their early career record is thin, but what survives is significant. Both brothers worked at the Stanley Works in New Britain, Connecticut, one of the great American tool manufacturers. Miles also spent time at the Edison Phonograph Company, which means he worked in Thomas Edison's industrial orbit, building the precision components that made early phonographs function. Both brothers reportedly studied engineering at Purdue University, though Purdue's own alumni records have not been independently verified on this point. What is known for sure is that by the time they were in their mid-30s, they had accumulated roughly 20 years of hands-on tool and die experience between them. In the early 1900s, precision metalworking was trapped inside giant factories. If a small repair shop needed a custom part turned on a lathe, the work had to be sent out to heavy industry. The big lathe manufacturers, companies like Monarch and Lodge and Shipley, built enormous machines designed for factory floors. The market offered nothing for the independent mechanic, the small-town repair shop, the vocational school, or the self-taught hobbyist who wanted real precision at a price he could afford. John and Miles saw the gap. On November 1st, 1906, at the age of 35, they founded the South Bend Works in South Bend, Indiana. The city was already a manufacturing hub. Studebaker, the wagon and automobile giant, operated a 200-acre complex there that would eventually employ 24,000 people. Oliver Chilled Plow Works built agricultural equipment. Singer Sewing Machine had a plant on East Madison Street. South Bend was the kind of city where a machine tool startup could find skilled labor, cheap iron, and customers within walking distance. The brothers leased their first shop at the corner of West Washington and Johnson Streets for $65 a month. They personally supervised the casting, machining, and hand-scraping of the lathe beds. Their early machines were flat belt driven, powered by overhead line shafts, and they were simple by design. The O'Briens were not trying to compete with the industrial giants. They wanted a lathe that was accurate, affordable, and small enough for a basement shop. That exact mix did not exist in the American market in 1906. Within 2 years, they had outgrown the rented shop. In 1908, they moved into the former Singer Sewing Machine plant at 425 East Madison Street, right along the St. Joseph River. That building would become the heart of South Bend Lathe operations for the next half-century. But the most brilliant decision John and Miles ever made had nothing to do with iron or steel. It had to do with paper. In 1907, just 1 year after founding the company, they released a short instructional pamphlet on how to operate a screw-cutting lathe. Over the next several years, that pamphlet expanded into a full book titled How to Run a Lathe, The Care and Operation of a Screw-Cutting Lathe. They wrote it themselves, and it was a masterpiece of technical plainness. It explained the complex operations of turning, facing, threading, boring, and knurling into simple illustrated steps that a complete beginner could follow. The real brilliance was not the book itself, but the business model around it. South Bend sold how to run a lathe at cost price, often for just $25, and gave it away for free to vocational schools and apprentices across the country. At the same time, they offered steep discounts on their machines to those same schools. The result was a whole generation of young machinists who learned their trade on South Bend equipment using South Bend literature and who carried that brand loyalty for the rest of their careers. When those students graduated and opened their own shops or became purchasing managers at larger factories, they bought the machines they already knew how to run. By the end of the 1920s, how to run a lathe had been translated into French, Spanish, and Portuguese. It would eventually reach 56 editions and sell more than 2.5 million copies worldwide. At least 75% of the schools and colleges in the United States were using South Bend lathes in their engineering, vocational, and technical departments. The strategy built a moat that no competitor could cross. You could build a cheaper lathe. You could build a bigger lathe. But you could not duplicate a generation of trained operators who already knew the South Bend by feel. By 1929, South Bend was producing 47% of all engine lathes produced in the United States with customers in 88 countries. Their cable address used for international telegraph orders was a single word: twins. The customer list looked like a directory of American industrial power. Thomas Edison's laboratory used South Bend machines. So did Henry Ford's factory floors, the maintenance shops of American Airlines, the physics department at MIT, and the engineering school at the University of Notre Dame, which purchased 26 lathes in a single order. Admiral Richard Byrd carried South Bend lathes on both of his Antarctic expeditions. Lockheed, Boeing, and Chevrolet all ran them. The brothers managed the company with a structure as unusual as their birth. They swapped the presidency every 2 years. One twin served as president while the other served as vice president, and then they switched. It was a system that distributed power equally and by all accounts worked without friction for 3 decades. But the Depression nearly destroyed everything. The stock market crash of 1929 destroyed capital spending across American industry. Factories stopped buying machines. South Bend's order books went effectively to zero. The brothers faced the prospect of laying off hundreds of workers in the middle of the worst economic disaster in the country's history. Their response was a desperate pivot that would define the company for the next 60 years. In 1933, they designed the 9-inch workshop lathe, designated Model 5, and released it in January 1934 at a price of $75. That works out to roughly $1,700 today. It was a genuine precision machine tool, stripped of non-essential features, but retaining the core accuracy of its larger siblings. They advertised it in Popular Mechanics and Popular Science, and they marketed it directly to the Depression-era spirit of self-reliance. The pitch was simple. Buy this lathe, put it in your garage, and you can launch a business repairing auto parts, truing armatures, and making custom tools. You do not need a factory. You need $75 and a copy of How to Run a Lathe. The 9-inch was not without competition. Atlas Press Company, founded in 1911 in Kalamazoo, Michigan, had made a similar Depression-era pivot into small metal lathes and sold them through Sears under the Craftsman brand. Atlas was cheaper on paper, and by the late 1950s it would claim to be the second largest manufacturer of machines in its size class. But Atlas lathes were widely regarded by machinists as the lower end of the American market, built to a price rather than to a tolerance. Logan Engineering sold a quality competitor through Montgomery Ward. Clausing Sheldon and a handful of others occupied various rungs of the market. What none of them had was the educational network South Bend had spent decades building. The schools ran South Bend machines. The textbook was South Bend's textbook. The brand loyalty was already cemented before the first Atlas lathe rolled off the line. It worked. The 9-inch workshop lathe sold in huge numbers and kept the company alive through the worst years of the Depression. By 1936, South Bend employed 475 workers, producing roughly 100 different lathe configurations, from 9 inches to 16 inches swing, with beds ranging from 2 feet to 14 feet. The Model 5 evolved into the 9A, 9B, and 9C variants, differentiated by the inclusion of a quick-change gearbox and power cross-feed. And alongside the 9-inch line, South Bend introduced the 10-inch Lad family that machinists would come to call the Heavy 10.